City, viewers were stunned by her marriage to her step-grandfather. Audio leaked of her calling church members poor and stingy. Now an HBO documentary has dropped allegations so explosive they're forcing everyone to rethink what they thought they knew about this woman. What began as reality TV spectacle has morphed into something far more disturbing. A documentary built on fact-checking, legal vetting, and multiple sources backing every single claim. The people coming forward aren't tabloid gossip merchants or anonymous sources. They're Mary's own sister, her cousin, and former church members who spent years inside this world and say they've been waiting for their chance to speak. This story is about power and manipulation, about the dangerous space where faith becomes control. A church that allegedly started with pure intentions and twisted into something darker. At the center stands a woman whose life sounds like pure fiction, except every twist has been documented and every allegation comes from people willing to show their faces and use their real names on camera. Let's talk about the real Mary Cosby, not the housewife throwing champagne glasses and making weird comments about 7-Eleven. We're talking about the woman behind the designer wardrobe and that controversial marriage, because what HBO just exposed changes the entire narrative. Back in 2020, most viewers had never heard of Mary Cosby before she appeared on screen as this eccentric pastor with unusual fashion choices and an even more unusual backstory. She lived in a mansion filled with luxury goods, ran a Pentecostal church, and carried an energy that felt equal parts captivating and unsettling. Some people found her oddly charming while others struggled to watch her, but everyone agreed she was impossible to ignore. The details that emerged were jarring. Mary wasn't just any pastor. She'd married a man who had previously been married to her grandmother. Take a moment to let that register. Her grandmother's widower became her husband. The man who stood beside Mama Cosby and helped build Faith Temple Pentecostal Church, who was woven into the family fabric, ended up marrying the granddaughter after the grandmother died. Mary framed this on the show as an arranged marriage. Her grandmother, known as Mama Cosby, but whose real name was Rosemary, allegedly wanted this union to keep the church and family assets intact. According to Mary's telling, this was Mama's dying wish, that her granddaughter would marry her husband to preserve everything Rosemary had built and keep Faith Temple Pentecostal Church in family hands. On the surface, Mary presented herself as obedient and sacrificial, honoring her grandmother's wishes and following what she claimed was God's plan. Even then, something felt off to viewers. The age gap alone raised questions. Mary was around 25 when she married Robert Cosby Sr., who was roughly 45 at the time, a 20-year difference. This wasn't just any marriage either. It happened mere weeks after Mary divorced her first husband, Dana Harris, in September 1998. The timeline tells its own story. Mama Cosby passed away in 1997, and within a year, Mary had ended her first marriage and married her step-grandfather. Robert Cosby Sr., who was already 20 years younger than Mama Cosby when they married, suddenly became the husband of someone young enough to be his daughter. That marriage brought power with it. Mary became First Lady of the church while Robert kept his leadership position, and together they controlled the institution Rosemary spent her life building. Here's where the HBO documentary starts revealing things the Real Housewives franchise never touched. While America was watching Mary on reality television, former church members were living with memories of a very different reality, one they're now willing to discuss on camera with their identities visible and their stories backed by multiple sources. Mary's sister Denise Jefferson stepped forward in the documentary with allegations that paint a deeply troubling picture. She describes strange behavior between Mary and Robert Cosby Sr. after Mama Cosby's death, behavior suggesting this wasn't simply a granddaughter honoring a dying wish, but something more calculated and strategic. Denise explains how the dynamic between Mary and Robert shifted after Rosemary passed, how Robert allegedly positioned himself as someone chosen by God to marry Mary and claimed divine revelation was guiding this union. This is where the alleged manipulation begins, because according to the documentary, Robert Cosby Sr. didn't propose this marriage in private. He approached church leaders directly, called meetings, and sat down with people who'd been loyal to Mama Cosby to tell them God was sending him signs. He claimed Rosemary herself, from beyond death, wanted him to marry her granddaughter, not her daughter, but her granddaughter, and he framed this deeply controversial decision as a divine mandate that couldn't be questioned. Think about that power dynamic for a second. You're a church member who loved and respected Mama Cosby. You've just lost your spiritual leader and you're grieving and searching for guidance. The man who stood beside her and helped lead your congregation is now telling you God wants him to marry the granddaughter, that this is part of some bigger plan, and questioning it means questioning God's will. That's not persuasion. That's weaponizing faith itself. Robert allegedly used people's belief systems, their trust, and their grief to legitimize something that by any reasonable standard seems wrong. According to multiple documentary sources, it worked. Robert consolidated power, brought Mary back into the church's inner circle, and together they stepped into the roles Mama Cosby left empty. Wait, brought Mary back. That detail matters enormously. According to Denise and other family members, Mary wasn't even active in the church before Mama Cosby died. She'd been disfellowshipped, kicked out, and removed from the congregation for behavioral problems and straying from the faith. The documentary suggests Mama Cosby herself made that decision, that the grandmother who allegedly wanted Mary to marry her husband had actually expelled Mary from the church while she was still alive. How does that timeline make any sense? How does a grandmother who removed her granddaughter from the congregation for bad behavior suddenly want that same granddaughter to marry her husband and lead the church? The contradiction is glaring and suggests that maybe the arranged marriage story isn't what Mary has been selling all these years. The documentary reveals that after Mama Cosby died and couldn't speak for herself anymore, Robert's version of events became the official story. He claimed Rosemary wanted him to marry one of her girls to take care of him and preserve the legacy, and he used his position and claimed divine connection to justify marrying someone who'd been estranged from the church. With Mary as his wife and first lady, the entire power structure shifted completely. Former members interviewed in the documentary say Robert Cosby Sr. wasn't the kind, gentle, grieving widower viewers might have imagined. Multiple people describe him as abusive, aggressive, and controlling, painting a picture of someone who created an unhealthy atmosphere within the church. They describe a man who ruled through fear rather than love, whose leadership style stood in sharp contrast to the legitimate, nurturing environment Mama Cosby had built. One former member describes Robert as tough and unkind, while another discusses the dramatic shift in church culture after he seized full control. The Pentecostal faith, for anyone unfamiliar, involves intense spiritual experiences like speaking in tongues, physical manifestations of the Holy Spirit, and emotional worship services, where congregants feel God moving through them. It's already a highly charged environment, and now imagine that environment under the leadership of someone former members describe as manipulative and aggressive. The documentary makes clear that everything discussed had to meet strict journalistic standards. This wasn't people saying whatever came to mind. Every allegation was fact-checked, legally vetted, and required multiple sources before making the cut. If someone made a claim that couldn't be corroborated, it got excluded. That context matters because what did make it into the documentary passed rigorous standards. These aren't random accusations, these are allegations serious enough to survive legal review and editorial scrutiny. Fast forward to the Real Housewives era. By the time Mary appeared on screen in 2020, she'd been living this life for over 2 decades. The marriage to Robert, the First Lady role, the church control, it had all become her normal. She brought that energy, that worldview, that sense of entitlement straight into reality television. During seasons 1 and 2, audio leaked of Mary addressing her congregation, and what viewers heard was shocking. She berated church members for being stingy and poor, told them she didn't want poor people around her, and said if they weren't poor, they were stingy, which made them still poor in her eyes. Then she claimed God said that, attributing her own materialistic, judgmental statements to divine authority. Listen to the mentality behind those words. A pastor, someone meant to shepherd and care for a flock, publicly shaming congregants for not having enough money. She criticized people who were supposed to be her spiritual family for not giving her enough, demanded birthday cards and financial contributions while calling them poor to their faces. This isn't spiritual leadership, this is financial exploitation, dressed up in religious language. Things got worse. A man named Cameron Williams came forward during season 2, approached Meredith Marks on the show, and described the church as a cult-like operation. He talked about shady practices, manipulation, and control tactics. At the time, his allegations seemed serious but vague. He was a former congregant with grievances, and Mary dismissed him while production moved on. What nobody knew then was that Cameron Williams had a much deeper, much more personal connection to Mary Cosby than anyone realized. The HBO documentary reveals through Mary's own cousin that Mary allegedly had an affair with Cameron Williams, and not just any affair, but an alleged relationship involving manipulation, power dynamics, and tactics Cameron himself later described as victimization. According to Dan Cosby, Mary's cousin who gets interviewed extensively in the documentary, Cameron confided in him about what really happened between him and Mary. The story Cameron told is disturbing. He said Mary invited him to her home and asked him to put on music. And after they sat down together, according to Cameron's account, Mary grabbed his hand and used it to touch herself intimately. She allegedly guided his hand to her genitals, and what started as an uncomfortable, unexpected encounter became a sexual relationship. Here's the truly insidious part. Cameron told Dan Cosby that during the affair, he felt like God was blessing him, believed that sleeping with Mary, the first lady of the church, and the woman who claimed to speak for God was somehow a divine gift. He thought he was experiencing God's favor through this relationship. That's the depth of manipulation being discussed here. A spiritual leader allegedly using her position, her authority, and her perceived connection to the divine to justify and sanctify a sexual relationship with a church member. Mary allegedly took Cameron on private jets, bought him thousands of dollars worth of designer shoes, and showered him with expensive trips and luxury items. Throughout all of it, Cameron believed this was God working through Mary to bless him. Only later, after the relationship ended and Cameron got therapy, did he realize he'd been manipulated. What he experienced wasn't divine favor, but exploitation, a person in spiritual authority allegedly using that power to victimize him. The documentary includes a recorded phone conversation between Cameron and Dan Cosby, where Cameron explicitly describes the affair and acknowledges he was victimized. He talks about needing therapy to process what happened, expresses fear about being associated with Mary, and voices concern about going down with her if things fell apart. He wanted his story documented and wanted people to know the truth in case anything happened to him. Something did happen to him. Cameron Williams is no longer alive. He passed away. The documentary doesn't speculate about the circumstances, but Dan Cosby makes clear that Cameron wanted his story told, that he feared for his safety and didn't want to be silenced or forgotten or dragged down with Mary if her world eventually collapsed. There's another layer to this that's almost hard to believe. According to the documentary, Cameron Williams was friends with Lisa Barlow, another Real Housewives of Salt Lake City cast member, and Dan Cosby alleges that Cameron actually helped orchestrate Mary's casting on the show specifically to expose her. Think about that for a moment. A former church member who felt victimized and manipulated allegedly worked behind the scenes to get Mary Cosby on reality television, knowing the platform and scrutiny would eventually reveal the truth about who she really is. If that allegation is accurate, Cameron used the very system Mary loved, the fame and attention and cameras, as a tool to hold her accountable. He couldn't get justice through the church and couldn't make people listen when it was just his word against hers, but put her on national television, let America watch her behavior, let the cameras capture who she really is, and eventually the truth would surface. That's exactly what happened. Mary's behavior on the show raised red flags immediately. The way she spoke to people, her materialistic focus, her bizarre comments and questionable judgment, the leaked audio of her berating congregants, Cameron coming forward with cult allegations, every season added new layers of concern. Now, with the HBO documentary, all those pieces connect into a comprehensive picture that's much darker than anyone imagined. The documentary also addresses Mary's family relationships, and her sister Denise speaking out isn't a small thing. This is family willing to go on camera and contradict the narrative Mary has been selling for years. Family members are saying the arranged marriage story doesn't add up, that Mama Cosby's alleged wishes don't match the reality of how she actually treated Mary while alive, and that the divine revelation Robert claimed was convenient justification for a deeply inappropriate relationship. Multiple family members and former church members describe a pattern: Robert positioning himself as the conduit for God's will, Mary using her role as First Lady to demand financial support and loyalty, both of them allegedly creating an environment where questioning them meant questioning God, where leaving the church meant rejecting divine truth, and where congregants got manipulated through their faith, their finances, and their fear. This is textbook cult behavior. Isolation from outside perspectives, financial exploitation, using religious authority to control members, punishing dissent, creating an us versus them mentality, and making the leader's words equivalent to God's words. Both Mary and Robert allegedly engaged in these tactics for over 20 years before reality television ever entered the picture. The documentary emphasizes that journalistic ethics were paramount. Nothing made the final cut without fact-checking, legal review, and multiple sources. People said things that couldn't be verified, and those statements got excluded. What remains is a collection of allegations that met documentary standards for credibility and corroboration. That's significant because this isn't tabloid gossip. This is investigative journalism applying rigorous standards to serious allegations. Throughout all of this, Mary Cosby has maintained her version of events. She's defended the marriage as honoring her grandmother's wishes, dismissed critics as jealous or misguided, and positioned herself as a misunderstood spiritual leader rather than someone who allegedly exploited her position for power and wealth. With her own sister, her own cousin, and former church members all telling a different story, that narrative becomes harder to accept. The timing of this documentary matters too. It dropped right as the new year began, which means Mary Cosby is watching her life, her choices, and her alleged actions laid bare for public consumption. The details that were private, the family dynamics that stayed hidden, the church practices that happened behind closed doors, all of it exposed. She can't control the narrative anymore and can't dismiss it as reality TV editing or manufactured drama. This is a documentary with journalistic standards. This is people using their real names and faces to share their experiences. For viewers who only knew Mary as that quirky housewife with the unusual marriage, this documentary serves as a wake-up call. It reveals that what seemed like eccentric behavior on a reality show may actually be symptoms of something far more serious, that the red flags weren't just personality quirks but patterns of manipulation and control that allegedly existed long before cameras showed up. The implications extend beyond Mary Cosby herself. This raises questions about reality television's role in exposing harmful behavior, about whether fame and scrutiny can serve as accountability for people who've operated in the shadows, and about how alleged cult leaders function when suddenly thrust into public view. Cameron Williams, if the allegations about his motives are true, understood something important. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Put Mary Cosby on television, and eventually people would see the truth. The documentary also highlights how difficult it is for people to leave controlling religious environments. Former members describe the psychological hold Mary and Robert allegedly had over congregants, the fear of eternal consequences for leaving, the belief that questioning leadership meant questioning God, and the financial entanglement that made departure difficult. These are barriers that keep people trapped in unhealthy spiritual communities for years or even decades. When someone like Cameron Williams did leave and tried to speak out, he faced resistance. Mary's power, her connections, and her ability to discredit critics made it dangerous to challenge her publicly. He needed therapy to process the manipulation, feared for his safety, and documented his story in case something happened to him. That's not the behavior of someone fabricating allegations for attention. That's someone genuinely afraid of a person they believe is dangerous. The HBO documentary gives voice to people who've been silenced. It provides a platform for Mary's sister to share concerns, for her cousin to reveal family secrets, and for former church members to describe their experiences. It does so with the weight of fact-checking and legal vetting behind every claim. This isn't a hit piece. This is an investigation into allegations serious enough to warrant documentary treatment. As viewers, we're left with difficult questions. How many other reality stars have similar histories that haven't been exposed yet? How many people are still in Mary's congregation potentially experiencing the same manipulation? What accountability, if any, will Mary face for these allegations? What does it mean that someone could allegedly operate this way for over 20 years before facing real scrutiny? The documentary doesn't provide easy answers. It presents the allegations, the evidence, and the testimonies, allowing viewers to see the patterns and draw their own conclusions. What's undeniable is that multiple people, including Mary's own family members, are telling a story that contradicts everything she's claimed about her life, her marriage, and her church. Mary Cosby joined Real Housewives of Salt Lake City as an entertaining, eccentric character. She exits the HBO documentary era as someone facing serious allegations of manipulation, exploitation, and abuse of spiritual authority. The woman who called her congregants poor and stingy. The woman who allegedly had an affair with a church member and used religious language to justify it. The woman whose marriage to her step-grandfather might not be the arranged act of devotion she's always claimed. This is what happens when reality television meets real investigation, when entertainment value gives way to journalistic scrutiny, when the cameras stop rolling and the serious questions begin. Mary Cosby's story is no longer just about unusual life choices or reality TV drama. It's about alleged patterns of behavior spanning decades, about a church that may have become something its founder never intended, and about people who say they were victimized and are finally being heard. The documentary is available now. The allegations are public. The people who lived this story have shared their truth. Mary Cosby, who built her public image on being misunderstood and persecuted, now faces the hardest question of all. If all these people, including your own family, are lying, why are they willing to put their names and faces on these allegations? What do they have to gain by speaking out? And what does it mean if they're when Mary Cosby joined Real Housewives of Salt Lake City?